All right, so as usual, we're going to start by reviewing what happened last class. Last class was, some of you weren't here because the Awana thing was going on. And so I'm going to review, maybe spend a little more time reviewing than I would normally. So the first thing we did was we wanted to answer the question, the only question that matters in this discussion. You guys remember what the question is that we need to answer? Someone yell it at me.
Is it really a human being?
Well, yeah, what is the unborn? What is it, right? Yeah. What is that thing that we're killing? And so we decided, let's look at it through a scientific perspective. And the science is actually quite decisive. The science says, through embryology, through genetics, through biology, that it is a living, distinct or separate human being. And so we went through that step by step. We said that we know that it's alive because there's no period of non-life. Think about this. It's one living sperm cell, one living egg cell, and they come together and they form one living zygote, human zygote cell. Okay, 1 + 1 = 1. So one-time math doesn't really make sense there. So you got no period of non-life. In fact, if it's the criteria of life, if you flip through any elementary school textbook, the 5 criteria of life are it's growing, it uses energy, reacts to its environment, stimuli, it's made of cells, and it can reproduce. Those are the 5 criteria of life, and it fits all of those. And we said that because it can be killed, it must therefore have been alive. Because abortion kills something, it was alive. So that's obvious. The second thing we looked at was that the unborn is a separate, distinct individual being. And we said that we can answer this, the challenge. It's actually called the personal autonomy argument or the bodily autonomy argument. We're going to actually look at that at the end of today's session. There's a more involved argument. It's called the violinist argument. Have you guys heard of the violinist argument? Okay, none of you have heard of it. It's actually the ultimate pro-choice argument. It's the kind of argument that when you hear it, you're kind of like, oh my goodness, like that's a powerful argument. A lot of people are taken aback by it. We're gonna look at that and hopefully answer it to some satisfaction. And so the argument goes like this: a woman should have the right to do whatever she wants with her own body. You hear it all the time. And we said there's 2 problems with that. It's a 1-2 punch. First, it's absolutely false that a woman can do whatever she wants with her own body, okay? And that goes for a man as well. A man can't do whatever he wants with his own body. In fact, the law restricts what we can do with our own body all of the time, especially when we use our bodies to hurt someone else's body, okay, to hurt someone else. And that's exactly what we're talking about. Second of all, it's not the woman's body. Remember, if you look at just from genetics alone, all of the cells inside the mother's body are hers. They have her DNA. But we said that the zygote, that single cell in there that starts to develop, it has its own genetic fingerprint, is what we called it. It also has its own gender, blood type, heart, brain, circulatory system. I mean, you could go on and on. It's its own being. And so that's, we know it's now a distinct being from the mother. The third thing was, not only is it a being, it's like, what kind of being is it? Well, it's a human kind of being. And we said there's 2 evidences for that from science. One is it's the genetic signature. It has a unique genetic signature. If we found a hair on the chair, we could take that into the science lab and we could tell if it's a human kind of hair or if it's a canine or a dog kind of hair, okay? And we can do that through like CSI, science. Okay? The other way is from the law of biogenesis. Essentially, the law of biogenesis says that all life comes from life and that all creatures reproduce after their kind. And so if you want to know what kind of being the unborn is, ask the question, what kind of parents did it have? If it had human parents, it's a human being, okay? Without exception. Without exception. It's a law of science, really. And I said that don't take my word for it. You consult any embryology textbook and you will find the same answer, okay? Any academic embryology textbook or teaching tool will say the same thing. Human life begins at fertilization when male gamete unite with female gamete and they give rise to the zygote. At that point, we switched gears and we looked at, I should remember to use this. At that point, we switched gears. We talked about how designed reproduction is, how God's fingerprints are all over it. And I can't go through all that again, but here's just a couple things. We looked at the oviducts and how they're exactly in the right place to pick up the egg when it's released from the ovary. And if it didn't pick it up, that's the end of life. We looked at the corpus luteum. That was that large scar. Remember, in the ovary, the follicle kicks out the egg, and then you have this follicle starts to break down if the egg is not fertilized. That follicle is called the corpus luteum. It's a large scar on the ovary, and after a few months of these scars, the entire ovary would be scar tissue. And so God designed it so that scar, it's the only scar in all of the human body that will actually break down into what's called the corpus albicans, which is white body, and it completely breaks down. It's unbelievable. Without that, life would be over. We also looked at the cilia. Those are those hair-like cells and how they move in the metachronal rhythm and actually push the egg, whether fertilized or not, down the fallopian tube. Without that, life would be over. We also said that there's the cumulus oophorus, which is fun to say, that actually surrounds the egg, and that's what actually the cells grab hold of to move it down the fallopian tube. Without that, life would be over, but it's a catch-22 because the cumulus oophorus doesn't allow or shouldn't allow sperm to penetrate. But here it is. The sperm, which is a completely different cell from a completely different body, has a highly specific enzyme in it that will actually digest through the cumulus oophorus, all these cells around here. You see this clear zone? That's the zona pellucida. The zona, also, it's like the shell of the egg. It's not a hard shell. But the sperm has to get through that. There's no way it's going through the zona. But it does. How does it do that? The sperm has another enzyme that digests through the zona. It's unbelievable. It's completely miraculous. It gets through the zona, and then it releases its contents, its DNA, into the egg. It's fertilized. But here's the problem. All those other sperm want to get in too, and they're coming in. And as soon as one more sperm gets inside that egg, end of life. So you better have some kind of mechanism inside that egg that stops the process, stops the sperm in their track, and that's exactly what's in there. There's these cortical granules that sit just outside of the cell membrane inside the egg. And as soon as that egg is fertilized by a sperm, they explode. And they send their contents into the zona, that clear zone, and that clear zone actually essentially solidifies. It freezes the sperm that are entering into the egg in their tracks so that no other sperm can enter. Listen, if you don't have all of these things right, that's the end of life. That's the end of reproduction altogether. Yeah, those are the things we looked at. There were some others in the back of my mind, but we can't get into those. And the last thing we looked at was 10 objections to this argument that the unborn is human that you often hear. Just a couple of them. One, some important ones. The embryo is no different than any other somatic cell in your body, any other body cell. So you pro-lifers, you're so stupid, you know. That's just the zygote is just a cell with human DNA. Well, hey, check this out. All the cells on my arm, they also have human DNA, and I'm rubbing them off. This is like mass genocide, right? If you're consistent. And we say, no, you're completely confusing parts with wholes. Those are parts of my body, but the zygote is a completely whole, distinct being. And so they confuse that. The second thing is that I thought we should reiterate was the embryo, they'll say, is on its way to becoming human. And that, again, confuses constructed things with developed things. We said that the embryo isn't like a car that's constructed from the outside with all these parts that get put onto it. It's more like a Polaroid picture. You guys remember what those are, right? Polaroid picture, where everything is caught in an instant as soon as you take the picture, and then it develops over time from within. That's what human life is like. And we're going to actually come back to that when we look at our philosophical case. Now, I actually came across one more that I had to throw in here. I was reading this week when I found some time, and there's a philosopher named David Boonen. David Boonen is a pro-choice philosopher. He's written a book called A Defense of Abortion. He's probably one of the best It's probably one of the best books defending abortion that's out there. And one of his arguments is, how can you say that a newly conceived zygote is a distinct living and whole human organism when you don't know the precise moment during the conception process at which a zygote comes into existence? It's true, we don't know the exact moment. Some argue that it's as soon as the sperm enters the egg. Others say, no, it's when the chromosomes come together and they have this crossover effect that happens and they form a diploid set. I mean, there's a little bit of debate within the scientific community on where that moment happens. And so, yeah, we don't know. But Frank Beckwith, he's the author of Defending Life, which you need to get, and most of this presentation is based off that. He's a pro-life philosopher. He says, although Boonen raises an important epistemological question, a question about knowing, when we know the sperm and egg cease to be and a new organism arises, he says nothing to undermine the pro-lifer's strong supported ontological case or claim that the zygote is a distinct living and whole human being. What am I talking about here? Well, this is going to help. George Clooney will help us. Does everyone agree that George Clooney has a beard in this picture? Are there any people that doubt that he has a beard right here? Anyone? No. Well, imagine I ask this question. How can you say that that's a beard when you don't know the precise moment when the beard comes into existence? Because see, is that a beard? I don't know. That looks like a bit of stubble there. When does stubble become a beard? Does anyone know? No, I'm serious. Does anyone know? Because Frank Beckwith says this argument, David Boonen commits the fallacy of the beard. I don't know if that's a real thing. The fallacy of the beard. He says, just because I cannot say when stubble ends and a beard begins does not mean I cannot distinguish between a clean-shaven face and a bearded one. Okay? And just as we may not know exactly when the one moment that it comes into being, we don't know it, we can still look at a zygote and say, no, that's a whole, living, distinct human being right there. Okay? I thought I'd throw that one in there. It comes up sometimes. All right, so where are we in this thing? We are going to give a philosophical case today. So that's class number 4. I can't believe there's only 2 more classes left. We're having so much fun. We should just extend this thing through the summer. No, I'll literally collapse. I will, on this stage right now. Okay, so almost all abortion choice advocates assume that the unborn is not a human being, like a newborn. But we've demonstrated that science has shown that that's completely false. It's a human being. So what they do next is they'll attack our first premise. They'll say, okay, the second premise, it has a solid scientific and rational basis for its veracity. So let's go back to that premise. Is that true? But it seems like it's a morally intuitive principle. It's wrong to intentionally kill an innocent human being. I mean, that just sounds right, doesn't it? And so what they'll say is, well, to escape the weight of this claim, it's wrong to intentionally kill an innocent human person, but it's not wrong to kill an innocent human being. And so you see what they did there? They'll change the wording from a human being to a human person. Okay? And then they escape the conclusion that abortion's wrong, because abortion only kills an innocent human being, not a human person on their view. And so they're making a distinction between human persons and human non-persons. On this view, it's wrong to kill an innocent human person, but it's fine to kill an innocent human non-person. Okay? That's where these kind of arguments go. To sum it up, the unborn may be human, but they're not persons. So how do you respond? Well, I respond with a question. Now, it's very easy when you get into these kinds of discussions to just launch into your case right away. They'll say, it's not human, it may be human, but it's not a person. And you want to say, yeah, it is a person, here's my reasons, X, Y, Z, and go into all your arguments. But here's a principle I use now. I mean, when I was in teachers college, I felt like the only Christian, and we would debate like crazy all the time, and I was with all these science teachers, and these are smart people, and we get into these great conversations, but they'd often make claims. And many of them were atheists and actually very evangelistic about their atheism, as a matter of fact. And they'll say things like, there is no God. There just is no God. I can't believe you guys believe that. And I would want to right away get into my case. Okay, I've memorized, 5 or 6 arguments. I can say in my sleep at this point. But that's not what we need to do as Christians. What we need to do is sit back and say, okay, you made the claim. Now you got to bear the burden of proof for your claim. So it helps to ask a question. Why? How did you come to that conclusion? Why do you believe that atheism is true, is what I should say in that situation. And then they have to give their arguments for their position. How did you come to that conclusion? Well, it assumes that they came to a conclusion. It's very charitable, actually, because most people in our culture actually just give slogans. They haven't really come to a conclusion. And so in this particular instance, coming back to this challenge, we should ask, what's the difference? What's the difference between a human being and a human person? Because it seems like we have these 2 categories now, and one you can kill, and one you can't. And so you better know the difference. So we need to understand the seriousness of this objection. This kind of distinction between persons and non-persons, that's been used throughout history, okay? It's been used to justify killing African Americans based on skin color. That was the distinction. Persons, non-persons. And then, we figured things out. Hey, they're actually persons. Let's move them over to that category. And then there was Native Americans. They were non-persons. They didn't have rights, not like us. And then we figured things out. No, they're persons. And then it was the Jews. The Nazis referred to them as life unworthy of life. Okay? They were non-persons. They had no rights. And then they got moved over to human persons, and now guess what? We got another one in there. The unborn. They'll say is not a person, and we're going to spend the rest of our talk dealing with that objection. All right, so remember the video I showed in the first class? You guys remember this girl. She's so memorable. The pro-life advocate behind the camera, he says, when do you say the unborn comes into being and has rights? And she says...
And are you saying that you don't agree it's another human being?
I agree it's another human being when it pops out of the lady.
So all of a sudden it magically turns into a human being?
Yeah, so when it pops out of the lady. But this is actually a very common argument. It's a non-person when it's in the lady, and then when it pops out, it's a person. And so she's made her distinction, okay? It's location. That's her distinction. Environment matters. Where you are has a bearing on your value, okay? Your location gives you value. This sounds ridiculous. It sounds as ridiculous as me saying, you become a person when someone gives you a name. My daughter is 1 week old, and it would be just as crazy to say that she became a person when we decided to call her Jocelyn. Those few hours or whatever that we didn't know her name yet, she wasn't a person yet. And it's just as completely arbitrary as that, and as ridiculous. And so she says when it pops out of the lady. So what we're going to do now is we're going to it turns out that the unborn differ from the newborn in 4 ways that have been used to disqualify the unborn as a human person. And those 4 categories, they go by an acronym called the Sled Test. Stephen Schwartz, he's a pro-life apologist. He came up with this acronym. The 4 differences are size, level of development, environment, and degree of dependency. You guys need to memorize this stuff. When you're talking with someone and you give your scientific case, you're going to move to the philosophy. You're going to say, yeah, they differ. The newborn, which is a person, from the unborn. And there's 4 reasons why they're different. And that is size, level of development, environment, degree of dependency. And what we're going to do now is we're going to look at each one of those distinctions, and we're going to actually do what's called a reductio ad absurdum. That is, we're going to reduce the argument to its absurd conclusion. Okay? That's what they do in philosophy. It's really cool. So So we're going to show that if you apply any of these distinctions, you actually end up just excluding members of the human community that we already consider to be persons. And so to help make this illustration, I have this, I'm a parent of 2 now, so I've been going through the parenting books. And there's this little book called The Do's and Don'ts of Parenting that I've been reviewing. And so I'm going to use some images to help with that. Let's look at size. So they may try, I'm waiting for, that humans vary in size. But does how big you are, does your size give you value? Just ask yourself, are men more valuable than women because they're larger or stronger? Are taller people worth more or have more value than shorter people? It's obvious that embryos and fetuses are smaller than newborns and adults, but why is that relevant? Clearly, your size has no bearing on your worth. Humans are valued because of what they are, not because of their size. Therefore, we shouldn't disqualify the unborn just because it's smaller. You'll hear that. It's so small. It can't be worth anything, right? It can't be valuable. What about physical appearance in general? Human value transcends appearance, whether we're talking about size or skin color or disfiguration or handicaps. So we can't disqualify the unborn based on size and physical appearance, okay? All of these, we would say, are human persons, regardless of those. Second, people will point to the unborn's level of development. They argue that they're not developed enough to be persons. It's okay to laugh. But does one's level of development really determine their value? True, the unborn is less developed than you or I, but how is that relevant? Some people will point to developmental capacities like self-awareness. If you're not self-aware, then you're not valuable. But if self-awareness really is the criteria that separates persons from non-persons, what do we do with the comatose? A person in a coma is not aware. What about when you're sleeping tonight and you're not self-aware? What about my 1-week-old? You could stare her in the eye. She is not self-aware, okay? She really doesn't know what's going on. And up to weeks, even months after they're born, self-awareness really isn't there, okay? And so that would, if we were really going to base personhood on this criteria, we would have to exclude all of these individuals as well. The same reasoning would apply. And so I think we don't want to base value on level of development. What about your environment? Does your environment, these are very helpful illustrations when you're a new father. You don't want to do any of those things. Does the unborn get value just for leaving the womb? Again, environment is completely irrelevant. In what way does your environment determine your value? And one philosopher put it, does where you are have any bearing on who you are? Okay? So this was taken, literally, we left here right before my wife's water broke. So that was like 9:30, 6 o'clock. There you go. And we're talking about a journey of 8 inches down the birth canal. Do we really want to say that that gives you value? I mean, this is just absurd. I want to show you Melinda Starr. She was born at 24 weeks and weighed 9 ounces. I'll show a portion of this video. There was no images out there. She was literally the size of her dad's hand when she was born, okay? 9 ounces is like a Coke can. Doctors worked heroically to save her life. Now, just take a look at her. And then I'll make a point. That's her later on. They show the picture in a second.
Show me your eyes. Show me your eyes.
Melinda Starr may be tiny, but to her parents and those who know her, she has the strength and courage of someone 100 times her size.
That she was always fighting, and all the nurses are saying that she was really feisty, that she was always fighting for her life.
She was 24 weeks old and weighed only 270 grams, barely more than half a pound.
In the first 3 days
So I'll just cut that off there. But what I wanted to say was, at 24 weeks, as she's in that incubator, now she has human value, but at 24 weeks, she could walk into an abortion clinic and the abortionist could murder the same child, the exact same child. Does that make any sense? I mean, if the abortionist came in when Melinda Starr was born and resting in her mother's arm and then killed her, would that make it right? In fact, that's what Kermit Gosnell was doing. He was giving birth to the children and then killing them. Maybe you guys heard the story of Kermit Gosnell. And now he's charged with murder. But like, how does this work? So it leaves the body and now it's murder, but just a few moments earlier, he could have killed the baby in the womb and it would have been fine. This doesn't make any sense. This reminds me of the Mason-Dixon line that divides Pennsylvania, which is to the north, Maryland to the south. If you were black and you were born in Pennsylvania in the early 1800s, and you were born in Pennsylvania, that was a free state. You'd be free. You were a person. You had rights. But if you were born just a few miles south in Maryland, which is a slave state, then you were entitled to no rights. So here's the slave states. The free ones are above there. How does that make sense? Where you were born, just an accident of where you were born determines whether you're a person or not? It's the same thing going on today. So your location should have no bearing on your value. The last thing is degree of dependency. So size, level of development, environment, and degree of dependency. Some of these things are just too funny. Okay, finally. Some will argue that the unborn is not a person because they're dependent on their mother for survival. But why does degree of dependency, why is that relevant to your value? True, the unborn depends on the mother for food, shelter, protection, health care. But how does viability equal value? The ability to survive completely independent of anyone or anything else, is that where you get your value? If it is, then we would have to exclude people who are on insulin. They depend on that for their survival. Kidney medication, like going on dialysis. Anyone who's received any kind of medical intervention to keep them alive. What about these two, Abby and Brittany Hensel? You guys heard of them? I think they were on Discovery Channel or something. They're conjoined twins. If there was ever an example of two people that are completely biologically dependent on each other for their survival, it's these two. But do we really want to say that Brittany is no longer valuable because she's dependent on her sister for her survival? Does that make any sense? Absolutely not. In fact, at least with the unborn, they eventually become viable. They eventually can live on their own. With these two, they will go their whole life and be completely dependent on each other for their survival. On this logic, these two should have less rights to life than the unborn. So the problem of trying to disqualify members from the human community through these arbitrary qualities like viability or environment or anything else, it turns out that you can use the same criteria to disqualify other members of the human community that we believe are persons. And so you got to be very careful when you make these distinctions. And we need to point these things out. If someone comes to you and they say, I believe it's size. Okay, then do some people have more rights? I'm pretty tall. Do I get more rights than the people who are short? I'm voting for that one. No. But that's where that kind of logic leads you. Now, all of these arguments can be boiled down to the Sled Test, but they can also go one step further. This is what we call age discrimination. The unborn are smaller because of the age they are. It's how old they are. That's why if they were given enough time, they'd be bigger. I mean, give my daughter 20 years, she's going to be 7 feet tall. I hope. The unborn is less developed because they haven't had enough time to develop. The unborn is in the environment it's in is because that's where humans develop initially. That's where they reside. The unborn is dependent on the mother for his or her survival because of how old they are. In fact, they're still dependent. I mean, my brother, is he here? He's still dependent on my mother. He's 29 years old. So just as those who are, whiter have no right to kill those who are darker. Neither should those who are older have any right to kill those who are younger. And this really is age discrimination. But you tell a pro-choicer that they're discriminating, and you've said like the cardinal sin, okay? You tell them that you're the inclusive one. You're the one who includes all humanity under the umbrella of persons, and they're the one who is being exclusive. They're the one pushing people out. And then all of a sudden they start to feel a little uncomfortable. You might be thinking, hold on, Tim, we discriminate based on age all the time. For example, you don't get a right to drive until you're 16. You don't get a right to vote till you're 18. Now, we certainly do discriminate based on age for some rights, but it's important to make a distinction on the types of rights we're talking about, okay? There's two types of rights that we're talking about here. One is legal rights. The other is what I would call natural rights or basic rights. Legal rights are those that are given by the government, and they're usually acquired by some maturity or accomplishment, performance, like the right to drive or vote. On the other hand, you have natural rights. People will say, that's my God-given right. And those would be natural rights. Those are the rights that literally we would say God has given you those rights. And they're the kind of rights that you get for being human. When you come into existence, those rights come into existence for you. And so the government doesn't grant natural rights, okay? The government protects natural rights. They don't grant them. They're there from the beginning. And so they're rights like the right not to be convicted of a crime without a fair trial or the right to life. If I go to the United States, I'm not an American citizen, I can't vote there, okay? Because I'm Canadian. But when I go to the United States, my right to life goes with me, okay? I still get my right to life when I go to the States, whether they protect it or not. If I go to North Korea, I should still have my right to life, but they just may not protect that. And so that's the distinction we need to make. Now, there's a bit of a paradox here, because when you ask someone who's pro-choice, what kind of right is abortion? Because they want to say, abortion is my right. It's my fundamental right. Well, if abortion is a legal right, then they really can't complain if the government decides to change the law. And that's what I'm fighting for. I hope that they change the law on abortion. And they really will have no complaint because the government gives laws, takes laws away, changes laws. That's just how it is. But if the right to an abortion is a natural right, then it's a right that you get when you come into existence at the moment of conception. Now, here's the paradox. What they want to say is it's a fundamental right that you get at the moment of conception. So what we're saying is unborn women have a natural right to an abortion when they come into being, but they don't have a right to life. Does that make any sense? If they want to argue it's a fundamental right, then they're saying they have a right to an abortion before they have a right to life. It doesn't make any sense. And so, in short, as far more reasonable to argue that although humans differ immensely in terms of talents, skills, accomplishments, degree of dependency, all of those things, they are nonetheless equal because they share a common transcendent human nature. Remember the question we started with. What's the morally relevant difference between the unborn, who they say are non-persons, and the newborn, who is a person? And we can conclude with confidence that there's nothing. And so we can move the unborn over there, and you'll notice there's no such thing as a human non-person. And so that category should be completely removed. There is no such thing as a human non-person. Okay? And like I said, this is the inclusive view. All right. So this entire time we've actually been looking at a question. And the question is, what gives human beings value? That's the question we've been looking at. Is it size, level of development? What is it that gives human beings value? That's what we're going to answer now. So I believe that there are really only two camps to be in on this issue. Either you believe that humans are valuable in virtue of what they are, that is a member of the human community, or you believe that humans are valuable in virtue of something that they can do, or some attribute that they have acquired, like size, level of development, environment, degree of dependency. Either you believe humans are intrinsically valuable, or you believe that they're extrinsically valuable. Now, even though science, biology, genetics, embryology, all of those things can tell us what the unborn is, it cannot tell us whether or not the unborn is valuable. Okay, it's a different kind of question. It's not a put down on science. I love science. But science and morality are in two different realms. Science can tell us, as a matter of fact, what we're killing, but it can't tell us precisely if it's wrong or right. And so we need philosophy to help us out here. So we're going to do a little bit of philosophy now. It's important for pro-lifers to know philosophy. So many pro-life proponents will ground their view in what's called the substance view of human persons. Whereas the pro-choice advocates, they prefer to argue what's called functionalism. I'm going to call the property view of human persons. Now, the substance view of human persons is grounds our case. The substance view goes like this. It says that living things maintain their identity through time and change. Living things maintain their identity through time and change, where property things, such as cars and machinery, do not. Okay? So what moves a puppy to maturity or a fetus to an adult is not some external collection of parts, but an internal defining nature. Okay? So we actually ground our view in our human nature. And we as Christians ground that in being made in the image of God, which we'll talk about more actually next class. So it does not become more of its kind as it matures, but it actually matures according to its kind. Okay? It doesn't become more of its kind. You don't get more human, but you mature according to your kind. A substance thing remains what it is from the moment it comes into existence. So notice the substance function in virtue of what they are, even if all their functions aren't actualized. What that means is, let's say you have a dog and the dog hasn't learned to bark yet. I still have a dog in virtue of its nature. It's like its canine nature. It's a dog. Whether or not it can do some kind of capacity like bark or wag its tail or whatever. Now, critics of the substance view of human persons believe that human beings are more like property things, okay? Property things are really just the sum total of all their parts. So a car would be an example of a property thing. If you change the tires or the engine of the car, is it still the same car? Probably not. I mean, one illustration I've read is if you have a deck and you one by one replace every single panel on the deck, wood plank on the deck, eventually you have a different deck, right? And so it doesn't maintain its identity through time like living things do, like human beings do. Property things have no essential nature. They simply come together by parts. Therefore, humans come to be at one point, but only become intrinsically valuable at some other point. So you have human beings coming into being, but then you have some property they get. I don't know, self-awareness. Maybe it's a heartbeat. Maybe it's pain sensation. You know, you're not a person until you feel pain or something like that. They'll pick all of these kind of arbitrary things to say, that's the point. In other words, they believe human persons are like cars without an engine. So I got my car here, but until I get that engine, it's not a car anymore. It's not going to be a car yet. It's a potential car, but it's not an actual car. And that's based in, remember, the constructed view. It's a completely mistaken view of how people develop. They're not like machines. I mean, we're surrounded by all this machinery and equipment, and so we kind of get this idea that that's how human beings develop. But really, it's not like that at all. We're more like the Polaroid picture. And so everything's there right from the beginning. You don't have to add anything. It's all there right from the beginning. And so human beings come into existence all at once, and then they gradually unfold themselves and to the world what they already are. Therefore, you never have a potential person like you have a potential car. The human being was always there from the beginning. And so you'll often hear these kind of property arguments. And I'm going to go through a couple different ones. But I want to show you one analogy that was very helpful to me and that philosophers use. Hopefully I won't put you to sleep when we go through this, but essentially this helps you kind of do a reductio ad absurdum on any of these arguments that have to do with pain or self-awareness or self-consciousness or any of those things. And so here's the illustration. It's in Defending Life on page 134 if you want to check it out. It says, suppose that your uncle, and I've kind of modified it a bit, suppose your Uncle Jed is in a terrible motorcycle accident. Okay? And this leaves him comatose for 2 years. During that time, he's going to lack all the immediate exercisable capacities for self-awareness and all those other things, and he has no sense of himself existing over time. Now, we got to ask, are you the same, or is Uncle Jed the same person, even though he doesn't have these functional abilities? Imagine further that when the 2 years are up, our Uncle Jed, he emerges from his coma with no memories of his past life. His wife and kids are complete strangers. He touches a hot stove and gets burned. He must relearn everything from speaking to eating to working with his hands, all of those things. In many ways, he's as much like a standard fetus as you could possibly get. Okay? Now, here's the question. What would make it wrong to kill our Uncle Jed during this comatose state? And the answer is, these guys who hold the functionalist view, they don't have a good reason. They want to say it's wrong. They absolutely want to say it's wrong, but they can't justify, they can't ground their reasoning. If it's just based on some capacity you have, well, he doesn't have any of those. He's equivalent to the fetus. And so what can they do? Well, if they're going to say it's wrong, what they're going to have to do is use the substance view. They say, well, he's a human being. He's maintained his identity through time. And that's why it would be wrong to kill him in that state. And so what's doing the moral work? What's doing the moral heavy lifting through all this? Well, it's the substance view of human persons, not this property view. There's a woman named Mary Ann Warren. She's written an essay on the pro-choice view. And in her famous article called On the Moral and Legal Status of Abortion, she says there's 5 traits that make you a person. And you got to be able to reason, self-motivated, communicate, self-aware. If you don't have these, then you're not a person. But again, we've gone through these. And using the Uncle Jed test, well, there's no way we could justify not killing him in that state. And so these kind of things happen all the time. But here's the question we need to ask. Why are these the important factors? What makes reasoning so special? You know, she puts like solving complex problems. My 2-year-old can't solve complex problems. You know, self-awareness. Why is that the defining factor? Why not having an innie belly button? You know, that makes you a human person. All you outies, yeah, you know what I'm talking about. You're out, right? So why is it these factors that are the ones that make you, they're just completely arbitrary and self-serving. The other thing is, these characters disqualify, like we said, the newborn. Remember, it's Peter Singer. He says self-awareness doesn't happen until, and he's a Princeton bioethicist, he says not until 30 days at least after birth. And so his argument is that you can kill your newborn up to 30 days after it's born. In fact, he says in his book, Practical Ethics, human babies are not born self-aware or capable of grasping that they exist over time. They are not persons. Therefore, the life of a newborn is of less value than the life of a pig, a dog, or a chimpanzee. Those animals deserve more rights than a newborn. But that's where this logic takes you. And if you think this is just, pie in the sky or whatever, there was a paper that came out in, I forget what journal it is, but it came out last month, and it was over this debate. And I think it's fueled by the Gosnell trial and some of these other things that are going on in our culture. Well, When is it? Where is the dividing line? And it reminds me again of the Mason-Dixon line, right? Abraham Lincoln, we were doing this, I know you guys think it's funny when you say they're, reducing something to absurdity, reductio ad absurdum. But this kind of logic is very helpful. Abraham Lincoln, during the debates over slavery, he said, you can say, if you say that A is white and B is black, is it color then, the lighter having the right to enslave the darker? Take care. By this rule, you are a slave to the first man you meet with fairer skin than your own. Right? And he says, oh, you do not mean color exactly. You mean whites are intellectually the superior of the blacks and therefore have a right to enslave them. Take care. Again, by this rule, you're a slave to the first man you meet with an intellect superior to your own. But you say it's a question of interest. And if you make it your interest, you have a right to enslave the other. Very well. And if he can make it his interest, then he has the right to enslave you. Right? And so he's doing this reductio, showing where this kind of logic leads. It essentially does away with rights altogether. Second, it also does, this kind of idea does away with human equality. If you hold to the functionalist view of human persons, you've completely annihilated the whole idea of humans being created equal. Think about this for a moment. Each acquired property used to disqualify the unborn as a person comes in varying degrees. Some people have better reasoning ability than others. Some communicate better. Some are more self-aware than others. These things are not all the same for every single person. And so why would we think that it would be equal for all people? Why do we think rights would be equal? It just doesn't make any sense. If they come in degrees, then so should rights, so should value. So isn't it more reasonable that even though human beings differ in these ways, with these characteristics, that we're still equally valued because we share a common human nature? The third thing is that the unborn has a natural capacity for all of these properties. Remember, the unborn, sure, these aren't immediately exercisable. They don't have self-awareness. But because of the kind of being they are, because of their nature, given enough time, they will eventually have those, they will eventually be able to exercise those capacities. They're all there from the beginning. And so the question again needs to be asked, why is it immediately being able to exercise these capacities? Why is that what gives you value and not just having them as kind of a basic capacity that's there that just isn't developed yet? They don't give an answer to that. Some will argue that it's brain death that determines the end of life. So maybe it's the brain waves, that's what determines when a person comes into being. It's this whole idea of the brain waves. But here's the problem with that. The brain dead person that's on life support, they're dead, okay? That is to say, the only thing keeping a brain-dead person alive or from decomposing is the machinery they're hooked up to. Their bodily systems no longer are working in a coordinated and integrated whole. And we talked about the zygote, they are working in a coordinated and integrated fashion. On the other hand, you have the embryo. They're fully alive, they're working in this coordinated manner. True, they don't have a brain, but they don't need a brain. An embryo doesn't need a brain to function, which is pretty incredible. Pro-life apologist Stephen Schwartz, he actually says the embryo's brain is in a category that we call not yet. It's coming. The brain will be there, but it's not yet. Well, a brain-dead person's brain is in a category of no more. Okay? If you're brain dead, it's not coming back. I'm not talking about being brain damaged either. I'm talking about brain death. You're dead. And so we can't use this idea of brain waves before and after to somehow give value and personhood. Okay, we're almost there. These are going to get heavy. I almost feel bad for you. Almost. All right, David Boonen. I told you, this guy is brilliant. He's a pro-choicer. He is brilliant. That's his book, if you think you can handle it. If you're going to read this book, though, you need to have right beside you Defending Life by Frank Beckwith, because he basically answers every single one of David Boonen's arguments. So opponents of my view will ground their right to life in interests that spring from conscious desires. Okay, this is really important. If you desire something, if you have desires, the ability to desire, then their argument is, well, then one of your desires is a right to life. And if you can desire a right to life, then you get a right to life. But you have to have desires. And so the pro-choice philosopher David Boonen makes this argument. He says that you can't have desires, what he calls occurrent desires and dispositional desires. An occurrent desire is a desire that you have like right in your mind right now. Like you're thinking, when will this guy just sit down, right? That's your occurrent desire, okay? That's a desire, and we all have those kinds of desires. There's also what he calls dispositional desires. Those are desires that you have, but they're not right there. You're not thinking about them all the time. Like the right to be healthy, or the desire, I should say, to be healthy, and that sort of thing. You want those things, but they're not always in the forefront of your mind, okay? And so he has those desires. And so he grounds them. He says that those only come about if you have conscious experience. And the only way you can have conscious experience is if you have organized cortical brain activity. And this is where it comes down to. If you don't have cortical brain activity, according to David Boonen, then you cannot have any of these things. And so that's it right there. If you can say cortical brain activity, then that being gets a right to life. Now here's a problem with Boonen. First, he never tells us why desire is the value-giving or value-making property. Why desire? I mean, we just looked at brainwaves, we've looked at all of these things. Why is his so special? He doesn't answer it. Notice these philosophers always pick some property that's value-giving that human beings can even have. What about flying? The ability to fly. Or the ability to hold your breath underwater for an hour like a sperm whale. That's what gives you value. Like why they always, it truly is self-serving. It's something that David Boonen has. And if he didn't have it, guess what? He wouldn't make the argument for it, would he? Second, these dispositional desires would not protect our motorcycle victim. Remember Uncle Jed? See, he thinks he's got himself covered. If he says dispositional desires, the ones you're not immediately thinking about, then when you're sleeping, you're okay because, you had this conscious experience before, and so you got these desires for a right to life. But in our illustration, the person has completely wiped out all their memories, all their experiences, all of that. They are essentially the same as a fetus. And so David Boonen cannot answer the objection that Frank Beckwith gives in his book about this comatose victim who's lost all their memories. In fact, he has to concede and say, you're right. That person in that time frame, the 2 years where he's in a coma, he doesn't deserve a right to life. It would not be wrong to kill him in that period of time. He has to bite the bullet. Third, Patrick Lee is a philosopher, and Frank Beckwith. If you start to get into pro-life philosophy, these are the names that come up all the time. They ask the question, what would make it wrong, this may sound crazy, but what would make it wrong to hire a scientist to alter the brains of a fetus so that they never experience organized cortical brain activity and thus never desire life? What would be wrong with that? To tweak with the brain so that they come out as some kind of, zombie, like they come out and we make them our slaves, or we just harvest their organs. Let's just have these beings that have no cortical brain activity, but we could take their hearts and lungs and everything else. What would make that wrong? Again, he can't say it's wrong because we're going before cortical brain activity. And he says, you have no rights before cortical brain activity, right? In fact, this kind of reminds me of, I don't have time for that. Well, there's a recent article that was written where they were actually taking, because of stem cell research, you guys know about stem cell research? Embryonic stem cell research, what they do is they'll take the embryo in the early stages, extract the stem cells. These are pluripotent cells. That is, they're cells that can become any kind of cell. So if you need to grow a liver and you need liver cells, we'll take the stem cells from an embryo and we'll somehow use those to make liver cells and grow a new liver for you, or something like that, okay? And so what they're doing, though, to get the embryos, what they want to do is they're cloning. They're taking an egg cell, and then they'll take your DNA and they'll put it in the egg cell. They'll take the 23 chromosomes out of the egg, put your 46 chromosomes in there, and that's cloning, okay? And then you're thinking, we don't clone humans. They do it all the time. As soon as they do that, it's called somatic cell nuclear transfer. You take the egg, you take the DNA, you put it in. That's how they made Dolly the sheep. Put the egg in there, or the DNA in there, and then they, spark of electricity, it starts to divide, and you have a clone. Now, they've never let one of these things grow into adulthood or into a newborn, okay? They usually kill them at 8 days when you have a blastocyst, which is all these stem cells, 100 stem cells. That's what we want. Well, what they want to do, where I was going with this, is they'll go into the embryo, female embryos, and they'll actually take the eggs from a female embryo. Yeah. So they're actually forcing motherhood on these preborn females. Because guess what? There's not a lot of women out there who are willing to give up their eggs for this kind of research. It's actually kind of dangerous as well. And so let's just go to these embryos. They don't have any rights anyways, and let's steal all their eggs. Because every woman in this room was born with all of her eggs before she was born. Or she had all her eggs before she was born. That's where I was going with that. Anyways, that was a huge aside. Where are we going with this? So so that's just giving you a flavor of some of the arguments, brainwaves, desires. There's so many out there, but here's the last argument. I got about 14 minutes to go through the violinist. Now, this is not a personhood argument for abortion. This is a bodily rights argument. What they say is, it's actually Judith Jarvis Thompson. She came up with this argument. This was in 1971. A lot of people, if you're in a philosophy class, you'll hear this argument. Basically, she says, okay, it's a human. I accept it's a human. I even accept it's a person. So all those people that we just looked at, they said, not person, not a person, not a person. She says, forget about it. I believe it's a person too. And guess what? You can still kill it. Person, human, still kill it. She says that women have an absolute right to autonomy. They have an absolute right over their own bodies and to do what they want with their own bodies. So Judith Jarvis Thompson, MIT philosophy professor, gives this illustration. It's very powerful, very powerful. She says this, okay? She says, you wake up in the morning and you find yourself back to back. By the way, this is an argument by analogy. So she wants to show that this right here, and have this in the back of your mind, that this is just like pregnancy, okay? If she can show this illustration is like pregnancy, and that this analogy shows that you're justified in, you'll see, removing life support, then you are justified in abortion, okay? So if you can see the parallels, if the parallels work, then her analogy works, and therefore this is a good argument for abortion. So you wake up in the morning and you find yourself back to back in bed with an unconscious violinist, a famous unconscious violinist. I don't know why a violinist. He has been found to have a fatal kidney ailment, and the Society of Music Lovers had canvassed all the available medical records, and they found that you alone have the right blood type to help. They have therefore kidnapped you, remember that, kidnapped you, and last night the violinist's circulatory system was plugged into yours so that your kidneys can be used to extract poison from his blood as well as from your own. Now, where did I go to here? Okay. The director of the hospital now tells you, look, we're sorry the Society of Music Lovers did this to you. We would never have permitted it if we had known. But still, they've done it, and the violinist is now plugged into you. To unplug would be to kill him. But never mind, it's only for 9 months. Is this still on the screen? No? But then, okay, it's only 9 months. So you're starting to see the parallels here. But then, by then, he will have recovered from his ailment and can safely be unplugged from you. Now we go. Okay. Is it morally incumbent on you to accede to the situation? No doubt, it would be very nice of you if you did, a great kindness to stay plugged in. But you have to accede to it. What if it were not 9 months, but 9 years, or longer still? What if the doctor of the hospital says, tough luck? I agree, but now you've got to stay in the bed with the violinist plugged into you for the rest of your life. Because remember this, all persons have a right to life, and violinists are persons. Granted, you have a right to decide whatever happens in and to your body, but a person's right to life outweighs your right to decide what happens in and to your body. So you cannot ever be unplugged from him. And then she says, I imagine you would regard this as outrageous, which suggests that something really is wrong with the plausible sounding argument. That's the one I've been giving. I mentioned a moment ago. Okay? So you got this idea. You're kidnapped. You're plugged in. And now you want to just remove yourself. You just want to unplug. That's it. And should you be able to? It's going to kill the violinist. Do you guys see any problems with that? Let's look at some. Okay, first, Thompson, Judith Jarvis Thompson compares abortion to just withholding support. You're just going to unplug. You're just going to withhold support. Beckwith says that euphemistically calling abortion the withholding of support makes about as much sense as calling suffocating someone with a pillow withholding oxygen. In reality, abortion is killing through dismemberment, crushing, poisoning, or poisoning. So it's not really the same. The parallels don't seem to be parallel to start with. Second, Thompson assumes the relationship between a mother and her child is parallel to a mother and a complete and total stranger. I mean, if she really wanted to make a good illustration, she should say, you wake up one morning and you're plugged into your son, or you're plugged into your own child. That would make the illustration more realistic, more parallel. Instead, this is a complete stranger. And do I really have the same obligation to strangers that I do with my own children? I mean, I don't have to look after any of you when we leave here, but I got to make sure that I go home with my daughter and put her into bed and make sure she's fed and everything else. Third, the violinist is unnaturally connected to the woman, whereas the unborn is right where they naturally belong. It may be unnatural to have someone hooked up to your kidneys, okay? But there's nothing unnatural about the unborn growing in the uterus. In fact, think about this. The uterus is the only organ in a woman's body that's not meant for her body. It's meant for another body. It's really quite awesome, right? It's there for someone else, not for her. And so she's naturally the unborn is naturally where she's supposed to be. It's not some unnatural hooking up like this. So again, that's not parallel either. Fourth, the violinist analogy, in the violinist analogy, the woman, she has no responsibility. Remember, she's kidnapped in the middle of the night. She just went to bed and she woke up connected to this guy. I mean, it was a kidnapping. She has no responsibility for being hooked up to the stranger. But barring the case of rape, which we're going to look at in week 6 in great detail, a woman must accept pregnancy as a natural consequence. She needs to accept responsibility for being pregnant. There's no parallel there. Although some pro-abortion supporters, like Eileen McDonough, now she's kind of an extremist in her view. She goes as far to compare an unborn child to a rapist who invades her body. Just as a rapist invades your body, so the unborn invades your body in the same way. And just as I have the right to defend my body against a rapist, I can defend my body against the unborn child. And so she makes that connection there. But here's the thing. It all comes down to consent for these arguments. You see, what they'll argue is, I consented to sex, I didn't consent to pregnancy. That's the argument. So the unborn's like a rapist because I didn't consent, but that is just completely absurd. Imagine if I was in my backyard playing baseball with my nephews, and I'm tossing the ball and they get a hold of one. They knock the ball through my neighbor's window. And we go up to my neighbor's door, we knock on the door and say, really sorry about the window. Can I get my ball back? I'm not paying for the window. Because listen, I consented to playing baseball in the backyard, but I did not consent to breaking your window. Right? Nobody consents to consequences. Okay? You don't consent you consent to the act that leads to the natural consequence. Okay? In fact, it actually is kind of hypocritical, because when a woman gets pregnant, wants to keep the child, has the baby, and the dad and the father, he doesn't want anything to do with it. What do the courts make him do? He pays what? He pays child support. But couldn't he argue, hey, I consented to a good night, I consented to sex. I didn't consent to a child. No, they don't accept that. They say, no, buddy, you knew what you were doing. You knew what you got yourself into, and now you're paying child support for the rest of your life. Or till they're 20, or I don't know how that works. So consent, when you consent to sex, you're consenting to possibly having a child, because that's the kind of act that does that sort of thing. And so that creates that sort of organism. And so the analogy doesn't work on all of those grounds. Responsibility, it's not there. On the natural versus unnatural, and the list goes on. The last thing, I have 2 minutes here. I just want to show you this argument. The bodily autonomy example holds that women have an absolute autonomy over their own body above all else. Now consider this illustration, okay? Let's say a woman has intractable nausea and vomiting that and she insists on taking thalidomide to help her symptoms. You guys know what that is? Now, after having explained the horrific risks of birth defects that have arisen due to this medication, she still insists on taking it based on the fact that the fetus has no right to her body anyways. After being refused thalidomide from her physician, she acquires some and takes it, resulting in her child developing no arms. So that's just one example on the screen there. Do you believe that she did anything wrong? That's what someone who gives the violinist argument, the first thing I would ask, I'd give this illustration, I'd say, do you think that they've done anything wrong here? And they gotta say yes. Would we excuse her actions based on some right to bodily autonomy? The fetus, after all, is an uninvited guest. In fact, you remember Eileen McDonough? She calls the fetus a parasite, okay? And has no right even to life, let alone an environment free of pathogens. Now, most people would say that this is morally wrong. But listen, if it's morally wrong to harm your child, then why is it not morally wrong to kill your child through abortion, right? If this is morally wrong to harm them, then wouldn't it be a greater evil to kill them through the act of abortion? And so I think this drives home the point, because it really registers home. I mean, you could use the same, you guys heard of Accutane? It's for acne. If you go on that, you actually have to prove to your doctor, I know there's a few doctors here, my sister-in-law is here, you have to prove that you're on 2 forms of birth control, because similar birth defects can result from being on these drugs. And so this is a very powerful illustration, I think, to show that absolute autonomy, we really don't believe it. We may say we do, but when it comes to situations like this and examples, and when it comes to philosophy, when it comes to the philosophical case, I know it's a lot of what ifs and illustrations and analogies, but it really helps get our moral intuitions thinking about these issues. Sometimes that's what it takes. Now, next week, we're going to talk about the theological biblical argument, and where we really ground our case is in the fact that we are created in God's image. And that's why it's wrong to kill innocent human beings with God, made in God's image. And so remember that we have the Sled Test. If you're with someone, just rhyme off SLED: size, level of development, environment, degree of dependency, and show that the substance view, which is grounded in our human nature, is really the view that is true. And so that's really all I have to say, and it's right on time, I think. And I'll close in prayer because I didn't collapse, and I got to thank God for that. Thank you, God, for giving us this night. Thank you that that I was able to get through this and communicate these ideas, and hopefully some of this registered, and I wasn't just babbling on like I can do. And so we just pray that this information would go from our heads into the heart, that it's not just an academic thing, because that can easily come about where we just are interested in winning arguments and beating up on the pro-choicers and just one-upping them and that kind of gamesmanship. But God, I pray that this would be so much more than that we would use these arguments to literally save lives. And so, God, just go with us as we leave here today. In your name we pray, amen.